Imagine you're the most powerful man in Western Europe. You've got castles, courts, armies, and a map that keeps getting bigger every time you look at it. You're not just King of England. You've stitched together a cross-channel superstate that reaches deep into France. Now imagine your greatest threat isn't a rival king, or a crusade, or a plague. It's your own children. Not one rebellious kid. 4. And because this is medieval royalty, they don't slam doors and sulk. They raise armies. They court your enemies. They call it politics. And the wild part is, you more or less handed them the tools. Titles, expectations, grievances, and just enough power to cause maximum chaos. Today on Royal Idiots, we're talking about Henry II of England, the man who built an empire with law, war, and sheer determination, and then watched his family turn his triumph into a slow-motion catastrophe. Welcome to Royal Idiots, the podcast where we explore the most powerful bad decisions in history. I'm your host, Melissa, and today we're looking at the life of Henry II of England. To get why Henry's story is so dramatic, we need to zoom out to the 12th century. Western Europe is a patchwork quilt of territories. A king might claim to rule a huge realm, but in practice, power is personal and local. Lords control castles, bishops control wealth, and travel is slow enough that governing at a distance is basically a full-time adventure. England, in particular, is coming off a rough stretch. Before Henry takes the throne, the country has been battered by a civil war known as the Anarchy, where rival claimants fight until nobody's quite sure what royal authority even means anymore. Castles pop up like mushrooms. Local strong men act like mini-kings. And the idea of law being consistent across the realm is more aspiration than reality. Across the Channel, France is technically a kingdom, but it doesn't function like a unified state. The King of France is powerful in theory, but many of his biggest vassals are powerful in practice. And one of those vassals will soon become the King of England. Enter Henry. He's born into the Angevin dynasty, a family with serious ambitions and lots of land in France. His father is Geoffrey of Anjou, and his mother is Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. That matters because Matilda spent years fighting to claim the English throne, and while she didn't ultimately secure it for herself, she never let the claim go. So Henry grows up with two things in his bloodstream. First, legitimate royal blood. Second, the certainty that the world owes him a crown. And when Henry shows up on the scene, he's not a dreamy night poet type. He's practical, energetic, restless. He's the kind of person who treats ruling like a job you do at high speed, with no coffee breaks and very little sleep. Segment 2, Rise to Power. Henry's path to the throne is a mix of inheritance, timing, and one of the most high-impact marriages in medieval history. First, inheritance. Henry becomes Count of Anjou and inherits Normandy, giving him a strong base in France. That alone makes him a major player. But then comes the power move that basically reshapes Western Europe. Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. If that name rings a bell, it should. Eleanor is not just noble. She's one of the most influential women of the Middle Ages. She was previously married to the King of France. That marriage gets annulled. And then, very soon after, she marries Henry. And with Eleanor comes Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory in southern France. So now Henry isn't just a strong noble, he is a land-holding juggernaut. Put together Henry's French lands with the future English crown, and you get what historians call the Angevin Empire. It's not an empire like Rome, with one unified bureaucracy and a single identity. It's more like a personal portfolio of territories held together by Henry's authority, his family ties, and constant movement. Think less central government and more CEO who never logs off. In 1154, Henry becomes King of England. And he gets to work immediately. One of the big themes of his reign is reforming and strengthening royal authority. After years of chaos, that's not just a preference, it's survival. Henry pushes for a stronger legal system. He expands royal courts, supports procedures that help standardize justice, and lays foundations that later get associated with the development of common law. In modern terms, he's trying to make the rules more consistent and make sure the crown, not random castle owners, controls enforcement. This is the Henry II glow-up era, the builder king, the organizer. The man who's stitching England back together while also juggling a vast set of French territories and a complicated relationship with the French crown. But here's the thing about building a powerful state: it creates friction. And Henry has a special talent for finding the biggest source of friction available and leaning into it at full force. Which brings us to one of the most infamous parts of his reign, the Thomas Becket crisis. Thomas Becket starts as Henry's guy, his close associate, his trusted administrator, his friend. Henry wants the church in England to cooperate with royal authority, especially in legal matters. There's a long-running tension here: church courts, church privilege, who gets tried where, and whether clergy are effectively above the king's justice. Henry, being Henry, wants clarity and control. So he elevates Becket to Archbishop of Canterbury, apparently expecting that Becket will continue being Team Henry, just in fancier robes. Spoiler, that is not what happens. Becket leans hard into defending church independence. Suddenly Henry's friend becomes Henry's most stubborn opponent. They clash repeatedly, the conflict escalates, and eventually Becket ends up in exile. When he returns, the tension isn't resolved, it's fermenting. And then we reach the moment that turns a political struggle into a moral earthquake. Henry, frustrated beyond measure, vents. He says something that, depending on the version you hear, is either a direct command or a catastrophic complaint. The gist is, isn't anyone going to do something about this priest? And several knights take that as a mission. They go to Canterbury Cathedral. And there, in one of the most shocking acts of violence in medieval English history, they kill Thomas Becket. It's hard to overstate how bad this is for Henry. Murdering an archbishop in a cathedral is not an oops, political miscalculation. It's the kind of event that turns a man into a symbol. Becket becomes a martyr. The church has a story it can tell forever. And Henry, whether he intended it or not, looks like the king who unleashed sacrilege. So Henry does damage control, public penance, political retreat in certain areas. The balance between crown and church shifts in complicated ways, but one thing's clear: Henry's push for control has just created a legacy problem that will outlive him. Now, if Henry's story were only about law and Becket, we'd already have plenty to talk about. But this episode's core premise is different. Henry can take an unruly kingdom and impose structure. He can manage nobles, navigate war, bargain with the papacy, and keep a sprawling set of territories more or less coherent. But when it comes to the small, intimate, everyday politics of family, he's out of his depth. Segment 3, the idiot moment. And I'm going to argue Henry's defining bad decision isn't one single day or one single order. It's a strategy. A parenting and power strategy. A long-term plan that seemed clever, and turned his household into a rebellion factory. Henry has sons: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. Yes, that John. Future King John. Magna Carta John. That guy. But we're not there yet. In a medieval dynasty, sons are both blessings and threats. They secure succession, but they also create hunger for land and status. And in a realm like Henry's, where so much is held personally rather than through modern institutions, inheritance is political dynamite. Henry tries to solve this with a move that probably felt like genius at the time. He has his eldest son crowned during his own lifetime. This is Henry the young king. And just to be clear, that nickname is not about vibes. It's to distinguish him from Henry II. The young king is crowned King of England, while Henry II remains fully alive, fully in charge, and fully unwilling to hand over actual authority. So imagine being a teenager, or young adult, crowned in front of everyone, told you're king, dressed like a king, celebrated like a king, and then you're basically given the medieval version of a toy steering wheel while your dad drives the car. It's symbolic kingship without real power. Which sounds like a recipe for resentment, and that's because it is. Now add the other brothers. Richard is intensely capable and intensely proud, largely associated with Aquitaine through Eleanor. Geoffrey is ambitious and politically sharp. John is the youngest, watching all of this, learning exactly what family politics look like when power is always just out of reach. Henry's bigger problem is that he can't stop managing. He doesn't delegate well, and he doesn't let go. He wants his sons to be satisfied with titles, promises, and future inheritances. But his sons want something very medieval and very straightforward: land, revenue, authority, and the right to command. And here's the comedy angle, because sometimes history is basically dark sitcom material. Henry built an empire stretching across 2 countries, but he couldn't run a functional group project with his own kids. Medieval parenting tip, by the way: maybe don't give all your sons a taste of kingship and then act surprised when they start shopping for allies. The first major explosion comes in the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174. The young king rebels. And he's not alone. Eleanor supports the rebellion. And Richard and Geoffrey end up entangled in the broader struggle too. Let's pause on that. Henry's wife, one of the most formidable political figures of the age, turns against him in a family conflict that's also a geopolitical crisis. This becomes an international problem because Henry's enemies see opportunity. The King of France has every reason to weaken Henry's grip on the Angevin lands. Other rivals and discontented nobles join in. What starts as a family blow-up becomes a full-scale challenge to Henry's rule. Henry, to his credit, fights back effectively. He's experienced, relentless, and still very much the best administrator in the room. The revolt is crushed. But crushing a rebellion doesn't solve the underlying issue, does it? It just teaches everyone what happens when they lose. It doesn't make them stop wanting what they want. And Henry's core approach remains the same: hold tight to real authority, manage every lever of power personally, and try to keep the sons contained through negotiation, partial concessions, and constant supervision. That approach might work with barons. It does not work with heirs who believe the realm is their birthright. Over time, the rivalries between the brothers intensify. The young king wants actual rule, not ceremony. Richard wants recognition and a secure base of power. Geoffrey has his own ambitions. John is a wild card, sometimes favored, sometimes sidelined, often used as a pawn in Henry's attempts to rebalance the family. Henry keeps trying to fix the problem with arrangements and promises. But the family isn't an administrative spreadsheet. Every decision about inheritance reads like a statement of value. Who dad trusts, who dad loves, who gets respect, who gets controlled. And in that environment, every son has an incentive to seek leverage however he can. If you can't get what you want from dad at the negotiating table, you go find it on the battlefield, or in the French court. Segment 4. Consequences. The immediate consequence is that Henry's empire becomes harder and harder to stabilize because the instability is coming from inside the ruling family. There's also the emotional and political consequence regarding Eleanor. After her role in rebellion, Henry keeps her under tight control for years. That's not just a family tragedy, it's a strategic loss. Eleanor is a political force, and their partnership, once a cornerstone of Henry's power, becomes a fracture line. Another consequence is that Henry is forced to spend time, money, and attention stamping out domestic disruptions instead of consolidating governance. When a ruler is constantly putting out fires set by his heirs, it becomes harder to make long-term stability stick. The Becket episode also continues to echo in the background. Henry is still ruling, still reforming, but he's ruling under a cloud of a martyr cult that makes the church a more complicated adversary. He's a strong king, but he's not all-powerful, and the moral authority of the church matters enormously in a society built on legitimacy. And then, in the middle of this family pressure cooker, tragedy strikes. The young king dies before he ever truly reigns. It's one of those moments where you can almost imagine Henry thinking, finally, the succession problem has simplified itself. But simplified doesn't mean solved. Because now Richard becomes the primary heir. And Richard is not the kind of person who waits patiently for power. Richard is charismatic, militarily talented, and absolutely capable of playing hardball. If Henry's goal is to keep the empire unified under his personal control until his death, Richard's goal is to get his share now, and to secure his future against both Henry's interference and John's potential rise. The final act is painful. Richard ultimately aligns with the King of France against his own father. Let that sink in. Henry II, the great empire builder, is facing a coalition that includes his own heir and his greatest continental rival. This is the outcome of the long-term idiot strategy. Henry's effort to control succession through partial empowerment and constant denial teaches his sons the same lesson over and over: if you want power, you take it. Henry is defeated, exhausted, and worn down by years of conflict that isn't just political, but personal. He dies with his authority shaken and his family relationships devastated. Segment 5. Legacy. Here's where Henry II becomes fascinating, because his reign is a bundle of contradictions. On governance, he leaves a huge mark. The strengthening of royal justice and the development of legal practices that feed into what we later think of as English common law, those are foundational. Later generations look back and see Henry as a king who made the machinery of government more effective and more standardized. On state power, Henry demonstrates what an energetic monarch can do: restore authority after civil war, curb baronial chaos, and coordinate rule across multiple territories by sheer administrative force. But on dynasty management, his legacy is basically a warning label. The Angevin Empire, held together largely by Henry's personal competence, proves fragile when the family that should secure it becomes its main destabilizer. And then there's the Becket legacy, which is almost its own parallel story. Becket becomes a symbol, a saint, and a pilgrimage destination. Henry's conflict with the church becomes one of those defining medieval case studies in the struggle between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. It's also worth noting that Henry's sons don't just inherit land. They inherit the family dysfunction. Richard becomes king and spends much of his reign away on crusade or war. John, later on, faces his own legitimacy crises and political disasters. You can draw a line from Henry's household wars to the instability that follows. Now it's time for the royal idiot verdict. So how should we judge Henry II? This is tricky because he's undeniably talented. If the scale were only about competence, he'd score high. He builds systems. He expands influence. He has the kind of political stamina that would make most rulers collapse by lunchtime. But Royal Idiots isn't a show about being generally smart. It's about the most powerful bad decisions, the ones that only a person at the top can make, and that reshape everything around them. Henry's big error is that he treats succession like an administrative problem and his sons like subordinates. He gives them status without agency, expectation without satisfaction, and just enough resources to become dangerous. Then, when they predictably act like ambitious medieval princes, he's shocked and furious. On the royal idiot scale, I'm giving Henry II, competent but flawed. He's not a royal disaster across the board. His reforms and his capacity for rule are real achievements. But his long-running family strategy is catastrophically short-sighted, and it ends up undermining the very stability he worked so hard to create. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube, and share it with a fellow history fan who loves a good royal meltdown. Next time on Royal Idiots, we'll explore the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is the woman who literally kept the show on the road. Because if you thought Henry couldn't manage his kids, wait until you see what happens when their mother does.